Well, good news. How are you all today?
Good.
Good. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Byron, and the Possibilities Organization for inviting me and allowing me to come and be a part of this noon hour with you. You know, when Byron and Carl and I met about a month ago to talk about my speaking today, we kicked over lots of different subjects, and we ended up with radical forgiveness and energy psychology. And I thought, that's great, because I've spent the last 30 years in exploring and studying energy psychology and practicing it. So I thought, well, I know that pretty well. And for the last 15 years, I've been practicing radical forgiveness. So I thought, well, that's great. And then he said, well, but you have 15 minutes in order to do that. So I panicked a little bit because I had kind of already preparing a speech that was like 45 minutes. So to that end, you know, given the light of what's happening in the world today, I decided that radical forgiveness would be the focus of my 15-minute talk. So radical forgiveness is the brainchild of Colin Tipping. He's the author of the book Radical Forgiveness. And Colin worked with cancer patients in the very early days of his work, and he began to recognize that people who had such difficulty with the end-of-life stage as they were going through the process of dying because of cancer, had a really difficult time because they had unforgiveness issues. They were still holding on to things sometimes from 30 years ago that they'd never resolved. And he noticed that through the work that he did with them, that when they were able to shift that energy, then they got better, and in some cases they even went into remission. So he knew that there was more to understand about forgiveness, that the traditional model of forgiveness that most people understand and utilize really doesn't work. So that led to radical forgiveness. So before we get into radical forgiveness, I think it's important to understand the foundation of what we normally think of as forgiveness. So we call it traditional forgiveness. And so traditional forgiveness or ordinary forgiveness is letting bygones be bygones. Something bad happened, and the person who did that wrong needs to be condemned. And maybe if they own up to their wrongdoing and say, I'm sorry, then we might forgive them. Maybe. You know, we have difficulty with that, don't we? We forgive and then we take it back. You know, something else happens, and so you know, it's hard to get there. So that issue of something bad happened, we need to forgive, but there's a greater need to condemn than there is to forgive. The need to condemn outweighs it. So Seattle University in Washington did a research study on ordinary or traditional forgiveness, they called it, and they discovered that it's very difficult to do using that model, and that there's a need for a lot of therapy in order to get there, and that it takes a very long time, in some cases 30 years. And there's no particular course or direction of how to get there. There's not a process that can, if you go step by step, you're going to end up in forgiveness at some point. So radical forgiveness departs from that perspective by being a shift in perception. So radical forgiveness is the shift in perception that's seen from the spiritual big picture. Whatever occurred was meant to occur for our growth, and our higher self called it forth. And so from that perspective, nothing bad happened. And if nothing bad happens, then there's nothing to forgive, right? Is that a stretch? You know, the first time I heard that, my mind went immediately to, well, what about the Holocaust and the 400,000 people in Darfur who were killed in genocide? And we could go on and on and on. And Colin says to that, well, if it works for one thing, it works for everything. If it doesn't work for everything, it doesn't work for anything. So whether you accept that or not, it's a much better story. It's not the victim-perpetrator story, but now we're looking at the world from the perspective of everything that happens for us, and that our soul called it for. So in thinking about this 15-minute talk, I decided that rather than going into the specifics of radical forgiveness as an educational process, I would just tell you my own personal radical forgiveness story. So in order to do that, I think of Sophia in The Golden Girls. She's about to tell the story, and she says, "Picture it, Sicily, 1914." So picture it. San Juan, Puerto Rico, in 1968. A 22-year-old military guy, which was me. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. I got a phone call my phone rang, and I went to, out of my fog, I went to answer the phone. And, when the phone rings that late at night, you think, something terrible has happened. So I answered the phone. It was my mother, and my first instinct was that, well, something happened to my dad. But she said my brother had been killed in a car accident earlier that night, and that my brother was a Boy Scout executive, and he was on his way home from a speech that he had been giving at a jamboree. He was stopped at a red light, and a drunk driver hit him from the back, his car exploding and blowing him out the back of the car, and he died on impact. So she asked me if I could get special leave to come home for the funeral, and of course I said I would. And so the next day I flew from Puerto Rico to Lubbock, Texas, close to where my folks lived. My dad picked me up at the airport, and I hadn't seen him in 6 months, and it was amazing how heavy the grief was on his shoulders. He was bent over, and he had aged 20 years. It was a shocking sight for me, and of course we were all in shock anyway, So I spent the night with my folks, and the next day we drove to Big Spring, where my brother lived and where he was going to be buried the next day. So that was December 21st. So we got to Big Spring, and I needed to have some connection with what had happened. It was so unreal, and because I was so far away, it just seemed like a nightmare. And so I felt like I needed to ground with what actually had happened. So we drove out to the crash site to just see where it happened, and I thought I would see skid marks where the driver had tried to stop to avoid hitting my brother's car, and there were none. And to me that was such a shocking awareness that whatever was going on with the driver of the car, he didn't even try to stop. So we found some artifacts that some things that were in the car, and my sister and my brother's wife was with me, and we were just in shock at the scene, and it was hard to talk about. We didn't have the words to speak about what was going on with us, and grief, of course, was not yet anywhere to be found. We were still in shock. So the next morning we had the funeral, and then the next day, which was the 23rd of December, we were burying my brother's body at the family cemetery in Milam County, Carl, close to Austin. And then I flew home from the funeral on Christmas Day. So you can imagine how all of that happening around Christmas, how the future Christmases were for my family. It was, we dealt with our grief by not talking about it. We dealt with it by not talking about my brother, not mentioning his name because it was so painful. One of the newspaper reports said that my brother was dead on arrival at the hospital, and the man who hit him was Mr. Paredes, who was released from the hospital with scrapes and scratches, and he was charged with a DUI and released on $500 bail. And I remember seeing that article the morning of the funeral, and I was so angry because I thought there needed to be more. There needed to be more, that he needed to pay for what he had done, and to be released from jail on a $500 bond was just not enough for me. So I carried that need for condemnation for that man. I didn't know what that looked like, but I knew that wasn't enough for me. So I had another year to go in my service, and so the next year, because I was in Puerto Rico, I didn't really deal with, I never really grieved, because I was away from home and I didn't see the everyday occurrences, the missing my brother, and so I just put it on hold, for the year. So in January of 1970, I came home, and my sister told me that the year had been a nightmare for her and for my parents, because my parents took out their grief on each other, and she was caught in the middle of that, trying to keep them apart, and she said it was a nightmare for her as well. And so for the next 15 years, we kind of lived in that way. So we have to fast forward now to 1985. 1985, I was living here in Oklahoma City. I had started a produce company, a wholesale produce company, and I had a retail outlet just up on North May, where the 7-Eleven is now, called Mother Nature's Natural Wonders. Maybe some of you remember that. And then I had a warehouse over at 63rd in Bryant, and so I was in the warehouse when it was in the summer checking the produce, and I heard this loud crash, and the lights blinked, and so I thought, what the heck, So I thought a truck had run into the building, so I ran outside to see what was happening. As I ran outside, I looked across the street, and I saw in the trees a twin-engine plane had crashed and was hanging nose down from the trees, the cockpit facing toward me, and I could see the pilot and the co-pilot in their seats, and the flames were coming up behind them, and instinctively I ran toward them to, I don't know what I thought I was going to do, but it was just the instinct of trying to do something. And just as I started running, the plane exploded. Then the plane, I found out later, was carrying ammunition, and they were overloaded. So the ammunition began to fire off, and being in the military, I knew what that sounded like. And so I hit the bar ditch, and when I hit the bar ditch, everything blacked out. So I just lost consciousness, and luckily I had a friend with me who had stayed back, and when the ammunition stopped going off, then he came and got me out of the bar ditch, and I was, unconscious for 2 or 3 hours, and as I slowly began to come back, I remember nothing but tears. There was this hysterical sobbing that came from somewhere deep within inside of me that went for days. It was like I was grieving for everything in my life that I hadn't grieved for in that moment. And so a few days later, I went to a therapist, and the therapist helped me to see that the witnessing of the plane and the explosion of the plane brought back the vision of my brother's car and the explosion of that. And so it took that triggering moment to give me permission in a way to grieve, because I had suppressed it so deeply into the cells of my body that it took something that dramatic to bring me to that grief. But even though the grieving helped me to give me some peace and around all of that, it still didn't do anything for my condemnation of Mr. Paredes. I still I heard later that he spent 30 days in jail and paid a $10,000 fine. But still, that wasn't, at that moment I was still I wanted him to suffer more than that because of the suffering that we had gone through and we're still going through. So fast forward again, am I past my 15 minutes yet? Moving forward to 1996, I was working on my doctorate in energy medicine, and I was speaking with one of my doctoral committee people, and she was telling me she had been to Australia on vacation, and while there she had gone to a workshop with Colin Tipping, the author of Radical Forgiveness. He was in Australia doing work with Aborigines on reconciliation and forgiveness for the abuses that they experienced. And she said she loved the workshop, and he had just written a new book called Radical Forgiveness. And she knew some of my story, and she said, maybe you need to read that book. And so I immediately ran out and bought the book and read the first chapter, which is Jill's story, which tells the story of her pain and suffering and how Colin directed her to look at it from the spiritual big picture of the history of her life, and stepping out of the victim role to seeing it from, there's a bigger story here to tell. There's something more to understand than what you're able to see at this moment that keeps you stuck in this victim's role, this pain and suffering. And so I began to look at my life from the perspective of radical forgiveness and the spiritual big picture. And I began to see that, I didn't know what the story was or what Mr. Paradis needed to learn from that experience, or my brother for that experience, in the same way, nor those men in the airplane. But what I recognized for me was that it took all of that to bring me to the place of following the reason I was here in the first place. My purpose in life was to become a therapist. That early on in my history I'd wanted to, but felt like that I couldn't. So all of that led me to becoming a drug and alcohol counselor, because in my mind I thought if I could understand why Mr. Paradis drove that car while intoxicated, it might somehow change things for me. So all of that, through all of those many, and there were many more things that brought me there, but it was that hit me, and in that moment I felt such a relief, and I there wasn't anything to forgive Mr. Paradis for at that moment. I realized that whatever all that was about, all of us had something to learn from the experience. It took me 30 years to get there. But once I made that transition, then I understood that, in the work that I had been doing with my clients in terms of forgiveness, I wasn't doing them any justice, because I hadn't gotten there myself. I was still, I could get to acceptance. We could accept what happened, but to get to the place of letting go of the need to condemn the perpetrator or the wrongdoing, I wasn't there. So it was I was so grateful and so overwhelmed with joy at having found radical forgiveness, and there's a lot to radical forgiveness. It's not just a book, but there are lots of tools that are involved in the radical forgiveness process, worksheets and workshops and so forth. But I'm grateful for all of that happened in my life. I can look at every single thing that happened and be grateful for everything, knowing that it was for my soul's growth, and then it was my soul brought it forth so I could become who I needed to be. More loving, more kind, more caring, more supportive, more present in the world to assist the world in healing from, from the wounds that we all have in different ways and different reasons. And so just to end, Why forgive? Personally, we have better health. We have more energy. You know, we're free from the past. Finally, after 30 years, I was free from the past. We have more peace and happiness. I can certainly attest to that. We have better relationships. I can attest to that. We're free from those old patterns, destructive patterns, because I went through drug and alcohol and, you know, to trying to numb out the pain, self-medicate. I went through all that. Spiritual growth, certainly. And collectively, we can heal the old scores between races, which is what Colin was trying to do in Australia. We can release collective emotional baggage. We can transform the energies of violence. Wow. We can reduce tension in the world. We can promote open heart politics. We can heal the planet, and we can raise the consciousness of the planet. Thank you very much. I appreciate so much the opportunity to share my story with you, and you've been a great attentive audience. Thank you so much.